me timer, or are you gonna
Hello.
do just like
Welcome to Steph's apartment.
I would say have it at
Here we go.
8, maybe. Yeah,
I
can
can do a stopwatch.
All right.
Hello.
Hello.
We
Welcome.
are ready.
You're like, Mama.
We're prepared.
Alright, here we go. Let's open.
Yes. Okay. Opening our envelopes.
I think he said this was his favorite part last time, right?
Oh,
Yeah.
that was my favorite part too. I definitely freaking impaled myself 5 times last time.
I just don't want to rip the paper. I'm gonna reuse the envelopes or the files or whatever. Smell that. Okay, here it is. You ready? The timer on.
I still can't see the paper.
Oh, okay. Tell us when you're ready, and then we'll start looking at our.
Sorry.
And then we'll
Okay.
start the timer.
Got it.
Ready?
Yes.
Okay.
Alright, hit start, or no. Wait.
Okay.
Start. Okay.
How much time do we get to look this over?
Somebody read it.
Is it 15?
It doesn't say. Let's just take like 10 minutes.
Okay,
How
that
about-
was, I think that's what it was.
Just pick questions you're interested in.
Some of these are actually exactly what they were in the study guide.
Hmm.
So that's great for me.
Big
Yeah.
fun.
Okay.
So maybe circle ones that you'd be okay with leading.
So we have to do 8, and there's 3 of us. I don't know what that means in terms of math.
It's not
I think I have to take off my eye. I think it's messing up my focus. I'm just like, there's an eye there.
Oh.
I don't know how this will look on camera.
Red and
Probably
orange
not.
pen with the same in this
What are you
light.
laughing
I know. I feel like they can see mine when I turn it on the camera.
about? Mom got little googly eyes stuck to our face, in case you're wondering.
Yeah.
All right. So I see 3 questions specifically that I feel really good about. How many are we each supposed to be able to count?
We need to-
We need 8
8
questions,
total.
so roughly 3.
Okay, I can do these 3 I feel pretty good about these, so let me.
I could talk about at least 5 of them, so I can choose.
Yeah. Find another.
Yeah, I
And-
found about 3.
If you need more pens, I've got tons in here. In the
Oh yeah, I'm
bag.
sorry, I stole your pen.
Oh, you're good.
10 and 8. Sorry, so which ones did you guys pick, just so that we are not all picking the same ones?
Yeah. Oh, 5, 6, and 7.
Okay.
I picked 1, 2, 3.
Awesome. Well,
1, 2, 3. Wait. So we have 1, 2, 3.
I can do 8, 10, and I can.
10?
Yeah, 8 and.
Oh, I didn't even see the back. Oh shoot. Okay. Well, actually, oh, shoot. Well, honestly, I feel fine about those 3.
Yeah. It's alright.
You know what? That's fine.
I can talk about conflict
That's fine.
management. Covers kind of a lot, so I can spend more time on that.
There are ones in the back that mine covered, but honestly, like, oh, that one's kind of good. Well, you know what? These are fine. I can pull in. I have stuff that could apply to multiple questions, so that's fine.
Okay, so we have about 7 minutes to just pull up some things.
Okay.
Alright.
Awesome.
Are you guys okay with me just doing 2 questions?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So we were doing 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Oh yeah, I should like mark that.
Which 3 are you, or which 2 are you doing? 8 and 10?
5, 6, 7, 8, and 10.
Okay, awesome.
1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Okay. Yeah. So. like color coded everything. So, but the numbers are getting confusing because there's multiple numbers. That's okay though. It'll be great. Pretty straightforward. Darn, I wanted to pull from some of the quotes from that one day. Whatever. That's too much information.
5 minutes.
Well, yeah, I'll just pull it out and like have it available. Just in case. Sorry, I smell bad.
Yeah,
I smell bad because I just came
like,
straight from the gym.
it might be my feet are smelling too.
Yeah. You need to take a shower by every time.
We're taking a final.
I wonder if they've got to watch this whole part, right? To make sure
I
that.
don't know. If
I was like,
were
did they
them, I
skip
would
it?
fast forward.
That's why I was surprised when they were saying like how we took the time to do this stuff. I'm like, really? You do that? Okay.
I lost my.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Sure,
usually.
this is an enjoyable experience. I really think so.
Yeah. I mean, we're fine.
Weird days.
Okay.
Do we want to just go in order, or do we want
Little fun noise?
I
think
think
we
we
should
should alter.
Yeah.
I was
They're
gonna
all
say that
happen
would
to
be
be,
pretty
like,
intense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we can go like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Dang, I have a lot of info for this one.
Yes, conflict management 1 is going to be a big question.
Oh my gosh.
It's like a whole chapter on it. No big.
Oh, discipline. Well, whatever's too late. I had a lot of good things to say on that. That's okay.
It's always better to have too much material than not enough.
That's true. One for chapter. Oh, this is a good one too. Excited about this. And number 5 is. Wait, shoot. 6 is just 1. 5 is 1 and 3. Sorry, my system. Like a crazy woman. That's pretty good. Sick. Oh, okay. 2. Loafing. There we go.
Less than a minute now.
I'm ready to start on pressure.
Yeah, just gotta make everything smaller in my space. Right. Note the modern psychopathology. Just chilling here. Just, you know.
Not to name drop or anything, but
Alright. Okay, ready?
Alright, who wants to start? Anybody feel particularly enthusiastic and would like to start?
I'm not sure how loud we should be. I feel like we should be louder,
Yeah.
more articulate.
We will project our voices.
Alright. Yeah, you can go ahead and restart that.
Yeah. Any particular order you want to go in?
I was trying to figure that out since we're all in a row.
Nose goes.
Oh.
I think that was you.
Okay.
I can tell.
Okay, yeah, because I'd prefer to do, like, in the order of them, like 5, 6, 7, not like all in a row, but like in terms of the ones that I'm doing. Okay,
Yeah,
so I can start with 5.
Cool.
So yeah, and then I can start with 5, and then we'll go to other people's. So
Sure. Yeah.
we're gonna start now. So
Start.
question number 5 says, how should the local church help an individual to discern how best to use their gifts and talents? So this kind of relates a lot to Kaufman, chapter 9. And I felt like it kind of related to some of the different things that he said about how discernment should be done and how to create a more inclusive community. This reminds me of like the things we talked about in class about like the involvement of the local church and like how that's like a really important part of helping us to discern, or well, helping people in general to discern gifts and talents. I feel like that was something that I just like didn't think about and that I really learned. But based on Kaufman and what he says is that, let's see. So basically, he talks about people's gifts in the church and provides this as sort of like a way to say that there's like self-worth in every believer and that it's our mission to work together as a body of believers and that God intended that there was differences. And so, like, you know, his logic was like, if, you know, the if theory of like, if God made, like, has the ability, you know, is all powerful and has the ability to make us different, then he didn't make identical copies of us as far as we can tell. So there must be a reason for that in like diversity. And so in terms of someone discerning their gifts and talents and like relating to the church community, I feel like this chapter is talking about like the mission of the church, and I feel like there's a lot of stuff about outward expansion and inclusion and diversity, which is very important, but also even as Kaufman talks about like evangelism in this chapter, there's like a sense that like that's not it, you know, like it's not just, it doesn't end there, and that's something I really strongly believe in. Like I feel like one of my spiritual gifts is kind of shepherd, so like caring for those in the flock, and it doesn't mean that I can't evangelize, but like I've learned that that's kind of a place in the church that I thrive, or that I really care for the believers, because I know that they still need support, and they, you know, constantly waver. And so so in terms of like the local church, he said a few things about oh, here it is. Okay. In chapter 9, he said, consequently, if the church is to have maximum impact on a disbelieving world, it needs to employ its resources effectively, in concert with Paul's emphasis on gifts. So I like how he ties in like biblical stuff. Technical term. Congregations should take an active role in assisting persons in the identification and use of abilities that contribute to church growth. And so the way he sees it is like the church would know your gifts and talents because, you know, if you're actively involved and that's like your local body of believers, you're doing life together, you know, and they know, they've seen you exercise your gifts and talents, and so naturally they would be the ones to have a better sense for helping you in discernment. And so,
and of course that hinges upon commitment.
Right. So just to hit up a few things that maybe could jog some discussion is just Kaufman recommends like that the congregation is involved in like mutual accountability. So helping each person feel responsible for using their gifts. So kind of giving people opportunities, like seeing areas of interest. I remember my church had been like we'd literally just take in every kid that it's like, oh, you play saxophone? Here, just play saxophone on the worship team, you know?
Right.
Like, I got involved in the choir besides singing by playing, like, clarinet and stuff. And I felt that it was so random, but it also really made me feel like they cared about things that I was interested in, and they, like, supported me, and it related to, like, my faith in the community around me. And so it was a way to know me. And then he also just mentions, let's see. Oh my goodness. I wrote a lot of things, but let's see. Oh, I guess just one more thing that I can open up in terms of helping with discernment. Where did I write it? Let's see. That's it? I already breathed.
No, you're doing it. So basically, kind of what you're saying
Yes.
is that.
Okay, that's it. Anyways.
Let me kind of try to summarize what you said.
Yeah.
So it's like we're a bunch of unique beings in the church, a bunch of unique, different people making kind of a unified whole, something that's maybe greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah.
Which is a really cool thought. Also, you mentioned kind of you being having the gift of kind of shepherding, but also being able to evangelize. So not just focusing on one gift to the expense of others, or assuming you can't do other things. And then also the church, both as an entity that can help guide you toward a particular gift. What was my second point there? Guide you toward our particular gift, and by observing you as part of your community, kind of help you realize what your own gifts are.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily all on you, all on one individual to be to discern what that particular gift is.
Yeah.
I think that's really profound, and I think kind of what it comes down to is, what are you passionate about? What are you good at? And that whole kind of, it goes into the whole vocation argument too that we hear about all the time. Go toward what you're inclined to, but you have a body of people around you to help you narrow that focus and to give you accountability.
Yeah.
I think also a couple of things. First of all, it's a really good way to make somebody's faith personal to them. If they can find ways to worship and ways to serve and ways to be a part of the church that's more relevant to them, because it's not just something that, you know, like, I think there's a lot of value in shared experiences and worshiping the same way, and you know, joining with community and unified activity. But I think there's also something really valuable about making it an individual practice as well, and taking something that you're already interested in and finding out how you can use it to serve God and to worship God is really, really valuable. Like, I think that, like, the dance, Zoe's Feet ministry here is really cool, because I think in a lot of churches, dance is sort of underutilized as a form of worship when it's talked about in scripture, and it's such a
It's still a little
way.
taboo.
Yeah, and it's such like an embodied way to express emotion, and when you can direct that into worship, I think it's really beautiful. So I think it's a good way to make, like, parental faith personal faith, and then turn that into shared faith.
Shared faith.
And I think also that it's really helpful for a church to be intentional about fostering the growth of these gifts and helping people to identify what they're good at, because it's not always obvious to people. I think, like, my church, like my home church, didn't really do a lot with, like, examining until recently people's gifts and what they're good at, and so recently they started getting more into that and involving the congregation more in, like, you are not just like a passive believer, you're an active part of this church, and we can pull that out of you, and, like, it's not like they're forcing you to act, but it's more like, I see this in you, and this is something that you can do well, and this is a way that you can use it to strengthen your faith.
Yeah, and just to wrap up, that's so true, and I feel like that's something that well, Kaufman and Butman kind of talk about it in the sense of, like, you know, like, it's proven that, like, behaviors this is, like, reminiscent of, like, the learning class that we're in, but it's like, you know, there's a likelihood that behaviors will increase or, positive associations will be created if it's, like, reinforced. And so, like,
Right.
Kaufman talked about just, like, giving people affirmation or, like, recognition of things. Because I remember my mom being very hurt one time during a ministry thing when they were recognizing how many years people had been in service, for, like, a 1 or something. And they, like, forgot some people. And she's like, I know it's silly, but, like, you can't help but feel hurt because it was like, you get the special pin or whatever. And, like, then you realize that, like, there's a legitimate concern there because it's so much further. It's so beyond the little pin, It's just like, I really want to feel part of this community.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to, like, give of myself and contribute. And so, yeah, I think that also helps too in discernment. It is, like, being encouraged at what you're doing and being a part of in the church.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's a good end to that one.
Yeah.
Oh,
Killed it.
sick. All right.
Great.
Next one. Who's next?
You or me?
I only got 2, so I feel like if I go now, then
Alright.
it's gonna have to be 2 in a row.
Sure, I'll go ahead then.
I could go though if you're not ready.
Let's go ahead with number 1.
Sick.
So I'll go ahead and take the lead on question number 1, which says, compare and contrast intrinsic committed and extrinsic consensual religiosity. This is something that's come up a lot and that Palutzian talks about explicitly. So basically we're going to start out with some definitions. Intrinsic means the reasons for one's faith lie within rather than outside of the person, and the reasons for faith become more of a fabric of one's personality. And a good way to put this in context is the faith is an end to itself. Extrinsic is kind of the opposite. It's a means to another end. And that definition is using faith for one's own self-interest, gains, or motives that lie outside of the religion itself. So, and this is also reinforced in behavioral psychology with that tangible reinforcement. So for instance, when I pray, I feel relaxed. That's a very extrinsic factor, and that's reinforced as you keep praying. I mean, some people don't get relaxed when they pray, depending on what you're praying about. But yes, and I think this has a lot to do with religious experience in so many different ways. We took that Quest scale of earlier in the year, how you perceive your own religion, whether it comes more internally or externally, and a lot of studies have been done on these factors. For instance, what is it? Give me a moment. So, high intrinsic motivation is associated with more psychosocial competence, so a coping mechanism that I'll go into more later, and then also with prejudice, so basically being intrinsic and committed, which is the fabric of the question essentially, because you can be intrinsic, have an intrinsic faith, but not necessarily committed to your faith. And that actually, I think that demographic tended to be much more prejudiced than the people who were intrinsic and committed to attending church frequently, who actually had the least levels of prejudice. And that was a particularly interesting study. So I think that is kind of the foundation upon which we build all these other assumptions we make about ourselves and others religiously. Yeah, do you guys have any thoughts about that?
Yeah.
Whatever, you can go.
I do have thoughts. I bet you'd like to know them.
I would like to know them.
All right, I'll tell you.
If I must.
I think throughout the semester, the discussion of intrinsic and extrinsic, like orientations of religiosity were interesting, and I think that it speaks to sort of a need to understand why some people who are Christians don't act like it. And
Wow, yeah.
something I was talking about with, I don't know, when I was putting together resources for this, I don't remember which question I was trying to answer, but something about, like, it's striking to me, and I think this is part of the reason why I wanted to study religion from a psychological perspective, how many Christians and how many of us, how many times that we are all poor image bearers, and we don't represent that which we say we believe. And so I think it really speaks to trying to understand, like, surely there must be some way to explain why, like, faith isn't acting the way we think it should, and why. And so I think the idea of, like, intrinsic versus extrinsic comes out of a sort of way to try to explain that the people who claim to be believers and act in a way that is hurtful or prejudiced, it's almost like they're trying to explain why they're not really faithful, almost. And I don't think it's entirely intended to be negative, but a lot of the ways they describe extrinsic faith is very much like, you know, you're just doing this because it's desirable for people to like you, or for people to, and I think that it's pretty clear to people who value religion that it's better to be intrinsically motivated than extrinsically motivated.
So I think it's natural to have some extrinsic motivation, but it's definitely more important to focus on the intrinsic side.
Right. Like, of course, there are benefits to being Christians outside of, you know, and we are motivated by where we find reinforcement, as behaviorism clearly shows. But I just think it's interesting all of the ways that they want to say, like, oh, all of these things that people tend to do poorly, which is where I also found it interesting when they were talking about altruistic actions, how they found that people who are intrinsically motivated will help, but sometimes, like, too much, even beyond the point where somebody says, like, I don't need your help anymore, you're fine, I'm done, and they're just like trying to be helpful
for its own sake.
Right. And also there are people who worry that people who can be evaluated as intrinsically motivated are also just trying to appear more desirable. So the quest orientation model. Sorry, I'm talking a lot about
No, that's all. That's so good.
Yeah, I just think that the quest orientation was an interesting model as well, kind of going on top of that. But
yeah, that's a really good point, because when you said that, I was going to say something briefly about, like, church growth and wondering, like, you know, motivations of, like, but, like, if they're sticking with the church and whatever. But when you said that, it reminded me of stuff I've been really wondering about lately, and one of them being, like, why, but then it made me think, wow, we're all hypocrites, but I was like, oh, why do we, like, how it's hard to know what's really going on in people's hearts at Wheaton, and how easily your heart can go all over the place in terms of, like, how on track you are with your faith, you know? Like, if that's, like, the forefront of, like, the outflow of how you're doing things, or if you're discouraged or depressed or, like jaded or whatever it is, that can make you, like, not have that as the forefront of your mind. But also why people go to a Christian school if they don't want to adhere to rules, or if they want to find a party scene or whatever. I mean, I've read a lot about diversity of opinion in the church too, not, you know, and various meanings of diversity, so that can make sense. But I was like, is that just something that, like, since their families expected them to go there, or there's a family history of it, or, you know, do they feel, like, this dissonance with themselves and, like, how they're acting or how they're outwardly appearing and, like, what they're believing? Because I think in worship it's really easy to get kind of, like, to overthink it. So I spent so long, especially, like, leading worship in small and large groups, like, just, like, I don't know, I spent so long just, like, trying to not worry about other people, you know, and just be like, you know what, like, I'm worshiping with them, but it's, like, about being connected with the Lord. And then it gave me some freedom, and because I have, you know, social anxiety a lot, and I deal with a lot of that, like, it's become easier. But I'm lately realizing that worship is, like, a communal thing, and that there's something beautiful about recognizing those around you without comparing or thinking too much about them or yourself or judging, because, you know, that's toxic and we're hypocritical. But yeah, I think it's just difficult for people, or just in a worship setting like all school or different times, you know, where you're just around people and you're like,
to keep up that religion, that worship for its own sake, rather than worship for, because community actually is a really good extrinsic benefit of faith.
Right.
But it is, in a sense, extrinsic. It's not that vertical God, me kind of thing.
Right, and, like, belief and behavior, like, if you're gonna go party and, like, sleep around or whatever, I mean, I'm not trying to be judgmental, but, like, like, you know, in the worship of God, like, I remember there was a fear in terms of, lately I've been thinking about interacting with people, like, how can you know, I don't know, like you just don't know what's going on in someone's head and where they're operating out of, so.
And I do, right before we end, I want to add one more thing.
Okay,
Just, no. That something about extrinsic faith, I think one of the big differences between extrinsic and intrinsic is that an extrinsic faith could be replaced by another faith. You think about it, so extrinsic, it includes personal needs for security, comfort, status, and those are served by religion, but Paluzian says they're also served by prejudice, so that feeling of being secure in oneself in relation to others. So Alport and Ross, they did a study and they said a life that is dependent on the supports of extrinsic religion is likely to be dependent on the supports of prejudice. So a faith that's focused on how you're benefited or focused on the things that isn't the faith itself could be make you susceptible to cult theory or other things like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Take bear cross.
The end.
All right.
10 minutes on the dot. Wow, nailed it.
All right. I can go next with question 8.
Take a banana break.
It looks
Yes.
really interesting. Could you like cut me a little piece?
Yeah, it's basically a banana bread with like vanilla pudding on top. Sorry, it looks weird. It's like partly frozen, but they kept it together more than being
Chill.
liquidy.
That's chill. Thank
Yeah.
you. All right,
Okay.
I'm gonna go ahead while I'm reading this.
Please do.
So question 8, discuss good conflict management principles that could be used in a local church. Well, there was a whole chapter on this, so I definitely have a wealth of material to talk about. But, so something that I've been sort of reflecting on in the past couple of years, especially since coming to Wheaton, I've been going to the same church in my hometown for like pretty much my whole life, and we've been fortunate enough never to experience a church split. Like, we've expanded and opened different campuses, but they like it was all like expanding and not breaking apart due to leadership conflicts, which is very fortunate.
Yeah.
But then also coming to Wheaton and finding people whose experiences are not the same, and encountering different denominations and sort of recognizing a lot of the differences within the Protestant church has kind of caused me to reflect about how splintered the church seems to be and how painful that is. Dr. Buttman says I have Catholic envy because they are more unified than the Protestant church, and I think that's pretty true. Well, this is good. But it's just painful to me when I see that the church is broken and to see churches split apart, because if we are supposed to be the bride of Christ and unified into one body and we're all fighting against each other, it just seems harder to make that happen, and it's harder to act in the world in a unified manner. Like, imagine if all of the churches were truly unified in the Holy Spirit. How much more could we act in the world? But this question is about how to manage that. So, Kaufman identifies 8, but like really 7 ways to manage church conflict, because he says you must begin and end with a prayerful approach to divine leadership, and divine leading. So that basically just goes to talk about how if we really are going to be a unified church, we have to recognize that the head of the church is God, and that comes first in all cases, always. So, always a good thing to keep in mind in everything. And then, I wondered why I wrote the word business, but I meant busyness, so that makes more sense. You need to have commitment to the time needed to work through conflict. It talks about how in the early church, when they had their first main question of church conflict, which was dealing with which law should we follow, they took a lot of time to make sure that everybody could speak and hear different opinions, and it wasn't a conversation that was finished quickly, which I think happens a lot. We tend to like say, okay, we'll discuss this for an hour and then take a vote and move on, which is a lot more helpful if we can actually talk through everything. And when we're so busy, this comes up frequently throughout Kaufman, is that busyness is like a barrier to faithfulness and to acting faithfully. And then, so it says to identify the core beliefs and essential questions. And this is the probably one of the most important things is, like, what is actually what does it mean to be saved? And what does it mean to be a Christian? What do you have to affirm in order to be a Christian? And I think that sometimes we add a lot to it. It's the idea of, like, what we add to the cross rather than the doctrine of the cross itself. So there's a lot of ways in which the church unify, like, we believe in the same things. We believe in Christ. We believe in the death and the resurrection of Christ, and that, you know, there is a God in heaven, that God is triune, and all of these things are core beliefs. And so other questions we can disagree on, which is another thing, is to agree to disagree on some of these different opinions. Like, for example, with exactly what kind of worship we need to use to, like that's not going to decide whether somebody goes to heaven or hell if they choose like if they prefer traditional worship versus more modern. But it's something that we split churches over, and that's not good, I think.
And just to tack on that one thought, Lucian reported a study where he's like, the most people who reject the faith do so because of those things that are added to the cross and not the core elements itself.
Right.
I mean, that doesn't speak for everybody, but a lot of it.
Yeah, I mean, if you're trying to hold somebody to an unfair standard, or to say, like, in order to be a Christian, you have to affirm this, this, and this, and this, which all seem unreasonable to somebody, you're just adding more barriers, and you're not allowing people to come to the cross. Also, to employ the strategy of the soft answer, it says in the words of James 1:19, to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And this is so difficult, I feel, with church conflict, because it feels like it's something that people get so passionate over and so convicted, because it feels like if religion is the most important thing, which in truth it is for a lot of people, and it has eternal consequences, if we feel that this is a question of faith and people disagree with us, then it's got eternal consequences, and it's hurtful and painful to see somebody that you love going down what you perceive to be a different path towards punishment. I gotta get through this faster. Recognizing diversity of beliefs and alongside of the idea to agree to disagree and to combine different opinions, and to seek an environment of unity. And this has to be something that we have to work at, because a lot of different ways of thinking, like it talks about how with prejudice along like racial and ethnic lines, it's a lot easier to overcome if you have interactions with people regularly, and you're regularly interacting with people of different races, different ethnicities, different socioeconomic backgrounds. It's easier to be less prejudiced towards them, but it doesn't come naturally with people of liberal and conservative opinions, which is really painful in the church, because even if you spend a lot of time with somebody, you're not necessarily going to naturally be less prejudiced towards them, or to disagree, or to be just less likely to listen. So you have to actually work at fostering an environment where you can have discussions like that. And
right. Yeah, and I really liked I mean, something with the diversity made me think of, like, I went to part of the sexual violence summit thing, and I didn't have a great idea of where people were coming into it on, but I knew, some things about evangelical, like, background and opinions. But I went on Twitter, went on other social media, and it was, like, blowing up with a bunch of criticism from various movements involving the gay Christian community, and like what their thoughts were, and inclusiveness, and like hurt. And I just had no idea about all this, and so I was trying to just like take it in, but like, I don't know, it just made me think that like, I felt so broken, like so torn of like, how do you just bring together, because I know people are hurting. But that being said, our job isn't to just fix it, but there was something that Justice Kaufman talked about, like when we're going through I don't know, like arguments or disagreements in the church, like the difference between like that there's extremes between like condemnation and like permissiveness.
Yeah.
I don't know, basically that like there's just different examples of like how we can just like address things, areas of concern in a loving way. And just the last sort of thought that he said that I was like, well, that's really true, is like if purity is a key concern in the church of like, wow, we have to have everything just like super perfect, then like sanctions and like rules and regulations will start to like overcome redemption. And that's getting back to like what you were saying about what is it to be a believer and what are we supposed to care about in, you know, in its core place as a church. So
Yeah.
Do you have anything
No.
I think one thing to just quick talk about here is also with the added like things we add to the cross. There's one like the reactancy theory and how people tend to push back against limitations or perceived threats to their freedom. If we keep adding things,
especially in the U.S. culture,
right? People want to push back. People want to say like, no, you've gone too far. I accept these limits because I'm a believer, but you can't ask me to do something that God didn't tell me to. And like you see that all the time with the debate here at Wheaton about whether this should be a dry campus. Because it's like, well, the Bible says we can, you know, we can drink. Like Jesus did it. So people rebel against that limitation. Is like going. I mean, I'm not here to argue about that, but I won't even be 21 until after I graduate. So, but just like. People who perceive limits above and beyond what they already agreed to are going to push back on that. So,
very true.
That's all.
Good stuff.
Great work. All right.
Wait, just a side note. Are they supposed to be like 8 minutes or 10 minutes?
8 to 10.
Okay.
10 to 10.
Oh, good, because I thought it was like 8 max, and I was like, sure, where are we?
Yeah, I know.
Okay, good for the clarification, because I was like, yeah, okay.
Can we do a tinkle break?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Break.
Do you want to just keep the camera rolling or pause it here?
I guess we can pause it. I'm gonna see if I remember how.
I want to edit it. Post. Crazy about that.
Wait, what is the little button? Is that?
I think that's just like takes a picture.
Oh, I don't know how my own phone works.
If you want.
Sure.
Okay, I hope I have the. Remember, I think I do. I think it was my recording somewhere. Also, do you want to close this window because when the train comes by, it gets really loud. Otherwise.
Sure.
Yeah, because I didn't want it to be stuffy, but honestly, I opened that window when I woke up in the middle of the night because I had really bad nausea for like 3 hours, and went back to bed, and then I started homework today, so it's been a crazy day.
I was in Indianapolis this morning, so I drove back.
Oh, dang, okay.
Little thing. Long drive.
Yeah. I keep forgetting that, like, whenever there's breaks, that there are breaks. And I keep being like, ooh, time to scour my notes again. I feel like, no, just breathe.
Just breathe. We're prepared. From our progress so far, we've all got plenty to say.
I was going to say, I feel like there's always more we could say.
Yeah, no, definitely. Talk about conflict forever.
Yeah, there's like so much for that. I didn't even see the questions on the back initially. I mean, a lot of the things tie together, so.
Yeah. Everything relates to everything else.
So that's why it's hard for me to like say, this is going with this question, or like this point to make. But also it could be fair with them.
I've got thoughts on a just world hypothesis. I'm so excited to share.
I'm excited to hear. Yeah. I'm like trying to balance like what I'm using here, and then like engaging and actually like listening and not like being all over the place, and then like thinking of ways to like. I mean, I guess spontaneously inserting things is spontaneous. The little jazz.
We should have had jazz playing.
That would have made this so much more bougie.
Missed opportunity. I suppose nothing's stopping me.
Yeah. That's true.
My uncle's in a jazz band.
That's awesome. I'm taking jazz voice lessons next semester. Because one of my friends did, and she was like, it's really fun.
It can be fun.
I can scat pretty well. It's cool. Wow, I do smell really bad. I'm sorry. Also, these blankets, pillows. If you feel so inclined. Just sit here and ride my hands together. My little anxious bean. Wow, that was interesting, Mike. I'll show them. Did we each take a question so far?
Yep.
Oh yeah, we did 3. Okay.
So I remember what we've done.
Yeah. I used too much.
5 more to go.
I use too much of the same system to like understand what I'm doing come tests because like I forget that there's already numbers and so I color code and I number code, but then there's like 3 different numbers. It's a lot. Oh, and I didn't have
Inspired by your recent
I find you jazz music. Oh.
Just told. Well, I mean, I can look. But
Oh no, it's okay. I used to have this. Well, I have a speaker, but it's like dying and I can't find the cord, so I could have left it at home last night.